Do you think some of these archetypal scientific revolutions, the Copernican revolution, the revolution of biology with natural selection and Charles Darwin, even things like the revolutions in physics with quantum mechanics,
Yeah.
do you think that any of these pose any challenges to, say, the Christian worldview? Is there anything about the Christian worldview that you think is at least challenged by these scientific developments?
Well, we need to take them separately.
Sure.
And certainly, as one person has said, at least one, that Darwinism proved to be an engine of atheism.
Yes. Well, I think this is the most important example here is
And
probably evolution.
it is.
Yeah.
Quantum mechanics actually, to take your other example, for some people, opened up
Yeah.
the possibility of freedom and all the business of giving, to put it this way, which I don't really like, space for God, so to speak,
Yeah.
and not confining the universe to be a deterministic entity. I think that it is a very interesting case in point that a lot of people jumped to the Darwinist bandwagon, and until relatively recently, it was often used as a reason to get rid of God in some way or other. My thinking of it is, well, it's quite complicated, actually. First of all, the idea that there is a creator God is not going to be refuted by a biological theorem. I'm not even convinced they're in the same kind of category.
Mm-hmm.
That, in other words, evolution, whatever it does, and I'm saying that quite deliberately, whatever it does, is not an argument against the involvement of a creator. I spoke to one very leading, well-known biologist who is a strong believer in evolution and is a Christian. And I said to him, in the end, if I'm pushed to it, God can do it any way he liked. So that if it happens to be that way, that is not an argument against the existence of God, any more than the existence of an automatic self-winding watch, which uses random motions of your arm to wind itself up, is an argument against the existence of an intelligent watchmaker.
Mm-hmm.
That calling in of randomness doesn't get rid of God at all. But of course, if you're going to use evolution as an argument against God, first of all, you've got to know that evolution is true and you've got to define what it does.
Mm-hmm.
That's the first thing. And here you run into very many more difficulties now than you would have done 20 years ago.
Right.
And I just make 2 points, and they're quite important points. And that is, we need to distinguish between evolution and the origin of life.
Mm-hmm.
Now, Richard Dawkins, as you know, who's a brilliant writer, I must say, I remember reading his book, The Blind Watchmaker.
Yes.
And what arrested me in reading it, and I can almost quote it verbatim, so that's a compliment to Richard, that evolution, the blind automatic mechanism that Darwin discovered, is the explanation for the existence and the development of all of life.
He said that.
Yes, it's in the book.
Yeah.
And it took a very long time for him to realize that the first part of that statement is false.
Yes.
For a very simple reason. Because evolution, again, whatever it does or doesn't do, depends on the existence of life
Yes.
to do anything. So it cannot be the explanation for life. Now, of course, people these days get round that by talking about chemical evolution and so on. That's nothing to do with mutation and natural selection, and we could go into that. But As a mathematician, it's the former interests me more. That is the origin of life itself, because it's almost equivalent, though not quite, to the origin of information. I see there a huge
Right.
problem. But staying with, now, the second part of Dawkins' assertion, it explains all the development of life. Now, here's where I think one has to be nuanced and to be fair, because Darwin was brilliant. He observed things that people had not observed. He observed changes. For example, the famous study of the finch beaks
Hmm.
in the Galapagos Islands. And I have a 1,000-page book at home, a famous book on that, and I've read most of it. And that was hailed as evidence, but of what? It certainly was evidence of cyclic change. What not so many people were aware of is that once the drought conditions disappeared, the proportion of long beaks to short beaks actually moved back to what it was before. But nevertheless, he could see that something was happening that filled niches and enabled existing creatures to adapt to new niches. Now, that seems to me to be uncontroversial because we can observe it. But when it goes beyond that to the creation, if I might use that word, of new life forms or all this kind of thing, I think that's a very different matter. Now, I'm very aware that I'm not a biologist.
Mm.
And secondly, I believe in Richard Feynman's wonderful dictum. He says the scientist outside his own field is as dumb as anybody else. And I've got to remember that. But I have tried to read my biology, especially in recent years. And I comfort myself that everybody from Darwin to Dawkins wrote for the intelligent public. They expect us to understand what
Mm.
they write. And I have a huge difficulty with that kind of what we may call macroevolution. But much more interestingly is what has happened in the last few years with so-called systems biology, where the Darwinian mechanism, well, natural selection was his, mutation was later. But if we put both together and we have the neo-Darwinian hypothesis, that has been called into very deep question as being totally inadequate.
Hmm.
Here in Oxford, Dennis Noble, one of the most fascinating characters, fellow of the Royal Society, and he's debated Richard on a number of occasions. And his argument is really in the end that natural selection, that neo-Darwinian thesis, doesn't need to be modified. It needs to be replaced because it's completely inadequate. Because now, and here I'm just saying what I read, the problem is, and it's a chicken the egg problem, that most simply perhaps can be realized. Here is DNA. You can't get DNA without a cell. You can't get a living cell without DNA. So how does that work? And what seems to me to be happening, and I've actually written quite a lot about this in a recent book, Cosmic Chemistry, Do God and Science Mix, that there appears to be a top-down causation, and it leads to a huge problem because it was enough level of complexity to discover that the DNA molecule was not simply complex, it was linguistically complex.
Hmm.
That is, it gave us a 3.4 billion letter long word in a chemical alphabet. And all those letters had to be in the right order. That is a stupendous level of complexity, which has no chance of being generated by random processes. And Richard Dawkins agrees with that.
Right.
He brings in something that that natural selection actually has a different kind of operation, but we're not going to that at the moment. But the point is now with the more recent discoveries of the nature of the living cell and all the chemical factories in it, there are levels upon levels of complexity beyond the genome. And that just beggars into uh, unbelief,
Mm.
the possibility that any known mechanism can produce that without the input of intelligence.
Hmm. Now, I'm in your boat, but but at an even sort of lower level below the deck, in that it's not just so much outside of my scientific expertise, biology, but I'm not even a scientist, and so I'm also aware of my limitations in being able to engage with this material. I do understand that on the popular level, I think like Stephen Meyer has been um, talking about this kind of thing quite publicly, and I understand that a lot of people are beginning to question at least Darwinian evolution. But to understand you correctly, would that entail doubting, for example, that, say, myself and a chimpanzee share a common ancestor? Because I understand that the mechanism of getting DNA off the ground and this kind of thing is this unimaginable mystery. But once we've sort of granted that, intelligently produced or not, does that suspicion go to that depth of evolution? I mean, like, do you think that there is reason to doubt that I share a common ancestor with a chimpanzee?
Well, it can do.
Uh-huh.
People are divided on that, and I understand the point very well. You know, from a mathematical point of view, if you take a set of things, you can often order them in a hierarchy. And that's clearly true in
Yeah.
the animal kingdom. You could use various criteria for organizing them. But the whole question of common ancestry assumes that you've got a mechanism that drives the one to the other.
Mm-hmm.
And I often use, well, I sometimes use an argument that I think Darwin was aware of in some way. I have a vague memory that I got it from one of his letters.
Mm-hmm.
But it's something like this. You and I are biologists, and there's desperate need in the world for some kind of grain that resists, let's say, floods and so on and so forth. And we sit in the laboratory and we genetically engineer a new type of wheat that's very successful. 1,000 years hence, people are investigating the archaeology of this, and they're trying to determine what is related to what. Now, they know nothing about us or what we
Mm-hmm.
did. And their research, if it's done on the basis of a dominant naturalism, will completely miss the fact that there was an intelligent input at one point creating this new level.